and welcome. So yeah, today there is no cat. You might hear her screaming outside my door. I had to close the door because we currently have a guest in our home and he is not on the list of people I feel comfortable enough around to film. So, door is closed. But anyway, you guys good? You good in there? You silly guys. I think it looks like they pulled their paper bag around, so there might be rustling. There's always a little bit of rustling. But anywho, today's video is one of the most common questions that breeders who breed both dwarfs and standards get, which is, can dwarf rats live with standard size rats? So, it's complicated. So yeah, a lot of people will give a simple yes or no answer, and I do feel like it's a lot more nuanced than a simple yes or no answer. I've mentioned it many times, usually in passing, because I just didn't think it was a topic to really go into depth with. But I keep seeing the question pop up, so I thought I would. But you have seen me say it before, or you've heard me say it before if you've been here a while, which is that in the UK the answer is no, in the US and Canada the answer is yes. So why is that? Why does the UK say no? Why is it okay for the US and Canada? And I'm going to go into that and the nuances that I feel are in the discussion that I don't feel like get brought up very often. So yeah, a lot of people are curious about that because they don't want more than one group, which is fair. I understand a lot of people don't like having more than one group. A lot of people see how many groups I have and they think that's insane. I currently have 16 rats and they're split into 6 groups that I'm hoping to bring down to 3 groups. I'm going to be doing intros with my dwarfs soon, all 8 of them. And we'll see if... Is she here? No, she's not here. But we'll see if Jojo decides to be a butt this time or not. At the very least, I think my 2 dwarf trios will be able to go together. And then I have 3 groups of standard size rats because some standard size rats decide to have an attitude, which is fine. I'm fine. But yeah, I'm going to be combining a couple of my standard size groups in the not too distant future. But yeah, I currently have 6 groups and that's a lot of groups. And a lot of people hear that and they're just like, I don't want that. I don't even want 2 groups. So that's why it comes up a lot, whether or not you can have dwarf rats and standard rats in the same cage, because people just don't want more than one group. And again, that's fair. I get it. Cage cleaning can be a nightmare. I kind of enjoy it because it's just a monotonous... You good? Was that you, Kelp? Was that you, Kelpie? It's just a monotonous task where I can just kind of zone out, listen to music. For me, it's relaxing. For most people, it's not. So I get it. But yeah, let's go into the issues that crop up when you try to introduce dwarfs to standards. Now, for full disclosure, I am keeping my dwarfs separate from my standards because for me, that is what makes the most logical sense. I do not have an issue with other people who don't do that. I'll go into further detail as we go along about why I chose not to. So the first thing we'll talk about is food. So dwarf rats tend to be half to a third the size of standard size rats, which sizing with rats is it's a complicated thing. It's never as simple as, oh, a third to a half, because some rats can get very large and then also some standard size rats are still very small. So we'll say about a third to half the size, just because that is typically what people say. Which means that they don't require as much food. So for my dwarfs, I give them about half of what I give my standards. I try to give them fewer treats than my standards as well, because dwarf rats are prone to obesity, and so my standard size rats can just kind of handle a lot more treats. So if I give them banana, they get about a 1/4 of the banana that my standard sizes do. And I find that works really well for my rats. You're always going to get some rats that are more prone to it than other rats. Rats as a whole are prone to obesity. Dwarf rats are just more prone to it. And when you have a mixed group, it can be harder to measure out the right amount of food. Now, if you feed a pelleted diet, I don't think it's as much of an issue because it's all the same food. So they're not going to hoard it. They're not going to steal it from each other. They're not going to overeat because they're not going to be selectively eating. To put it bluntly, they're not going to be as excited about their food. If you feed a pelleted diet, that's fine. That's up to you. But they're just not as excited, so they're not going to want as much of it. But if you feed them mix like I do, and I also feed them fresh food daily. So like I give them leafy greens and veggies and fruits and yogurt. And sometimes I give them things like egg or like chicken and like things like that. I give them that stuff daily. They get really excited for that kind of stuff. And like some rats are more interested in food than others. I will say I've noticed my dwarfs tend to take a lot longer to get as food motivated as my standards do. Most rats are very food motivated, but with dwarfs, I just find it's more common to get ones that aren't as big of a foodie. So when you have mixed groups, you can run into a situation where it can be hard to make sure that the standard size is getting as much as they need and the dwarfs aren't getting too much. And finding that balance can be difficult. Another issue is like just general, the size of the things in the cage. So some people say that dwarfs don't need as much room, and some people say dwarfs need as much room as standards. And as my policy with all rats, it really just depends on your rats in particular. I've seen some people say that they only use bin cages for their dwarfs, and I don't like bin cages, or they only keep them in previews, which is what I have my baby trio in right now. They're up there currently. If that works for your rats, that's fine, but I do find that while they do utilize the entire preview, I have Junimo and Joja in this single story critter. Whoa! They grabbed my shirt. Do you guys want attention? What are you doing? Do you want to come out? Juno and Georgia, they utilize this entire cage. And the reason a lot of people keep them in smaller cages is because they think that they're hard to find. I don't really have an issue with that with my dwarf rats personally. Like even Agatha, who is not very interested in me and very, very small, she does come out to say hi to me, and like you can usually find them. So I do feel like you can give dwarf rats a critter nation, even a double critter nation, and they're going to be fine. It only becomes a problem when they do not utilize the full cage. So if you have dwarfs and you have them in a larger cage and they're not utilizing the whole thing, that's when I would suggest downsizing. But if they are utilizing the whole thing and they're finding their food and cuddling with each other, then I do feel like it is a situation of the bigger the better. Junimo is digging through my hair. Hi baby. Hi. Hey, did you guys just need more attention? For your mom wasn't enough today? Want to go in there? Okay. And then it doesn't necessarily matter anything else in the cage except for maybe a wheel. Because like if you get hammocks that are good enough for a standard size rat, the dwarfs will just cuddle with the standard size rat. I will say I do feel like dwarfs need dwarf companionship because they are so small and they like to play a lot. And sometimes standards just aren't into that. So I do think you should continue getting like dwarfs in pairs if you can. But otherwise you can keep a standard sized things in the cage and the dwarf can use them. But you do need to keep things a little closer together because like as you can see, she's really small. Like she's not very big and she's like a medium-sized dwarf, I would say. So like imagine Agatha trying to like utilize steps that are for standard size, and Agatha's really tiny. She's like 70 grams. So I do think my babies. You wanna go back in? So like you can do it and it's not like that big of a deal. The only other thing where you might run into some issues is a wheel, because standard size rats need a 16-inch wheel. And dwarf rats need a minimum of a 12-inch wheel. And now most dwarf rats, I will say, I do think would be able to turn a 16-inch wheel. But the really tiny ones, I don't think could. So out of my dwarf rats, I don't think Agatha could. Bonnet might be able to. She's still growing. So as she gets bigger, she might be able to. I don't think Glitch would be able to. So you'd either have to put 2 wheels in the cage and hope your standards don't use the 12-inch or not have a wheel. And a wheel's not necessary, but it's something that I find my rats tend to enjoy having. I hear them running on their wheels all the time. We're not doing that. We're not doing that. So that's just something to keep in mind. But for the most part, the size of the stuff you can adjust so that it's both dwarf and standard friendly. And now here's the big argument, the one that people really have hangups on. And this is the one that I feel like has the most nuance to it because it is so rat dependent, in my opinion, which is dwarfs are a lot smaller than standards, so standards could do a lot of damage to a dwarf. And that is true. This is my biggest hang up too. This is the main reason why I don't have my dwarfs and my standards together. Because I've had a lot of standards that have had behavioral issues. And the thing with some of them, not all of them, some of them had just like general aggression issues and it wasn't that big of a deal. I got them spayed, their aggression calmed down. But like with Sailor, she even calmed down. She would go after her sisters and her sisters were just good at dealing with her. But if I had like a dwarf in with her, she could have done a lot of damage. She was a big girl. Like for a female rat, her like a good weight for her was 480. And for a standard sized female rat, the average weight is 250 to 450. So she was like a big girl. And then the gravies are what really kind of cinch it for me, even though I just got them and I've had standards for long, or I've had dwarfs for longer than I've had them. The thing with the gravies is that they are very unpredictable. So I remember when I was doing intros with Sunny, with the Weather Girls Baker and the Gravies, I was watching them and I saw Kelpie attack Foggy and there was zero warning. They were both at the top. Foggy jumped up and grabbed something. I don't even know what, probably a piece of food, but she grabbed something and Kelpie didn't care at first and then she finished whatever she was doing and she looked over and she looked at Foggy and I didn't even have a second to realize what was going to happen before she launched at Foggy and attacked her. So that kind of behavior is going to be really hard for rats to respond to because they also don't have a warning. So it's like I've heard the argument that dwarfs are pretty fast so they can get away if a fight breaks out. And that is true, except that they need a warning. They still need a warning. And I've had a lot of aggressive rats that gave no warnings. They just attacked without any posturing, without any puffiness, without anything except just like eye contact and then attack. And that is one of my biggest hesitations on putting standards and dwarfs together. However, not all rats are going to be like that. So like if you have a rat that is over 6 months old and you've done intros with them before, so you have like a really good idea of what temperament they have, and they're just like a gentle little fluff ball, I don't necessarily see a problem putting dwarfs in with them. The problem comes when hormonal aggression crops up or when you've never done intros with them, because those two things are the things that usually show you what their temperament with other rats are going to be like and if you need to get them neutered or spayed. And the thing with the sizes is where my biggest hang up is, because I get this argument a lot of just like they go to the extreme of like, well, I have a 700 gram male, I'm not going to put him with a 150 gram male. And I do get that. I completely understand that. However, that is an extreme because there's so much variation in sizes. It is not uncommon to get a female standard size rat that's under 300 grams, and you can get a female dwarf that is 200 grams. I have two of them. So like Polychrome's 200 grams, Joja is 200 grams. If I had a female rat that was like 290 grams, but she was standard, I would not have an issue necessarily putting her with Polychrome and Joja based on size alone. And that's the thing. This is my biggest hang up on like the no part of the equation. Because yes, if you have a 700 gram male, I don't necessarily think you should put him with a 150 gram male. However, breaking it down to dwarf and standard size does not necessarily make sense to me, because if you have a 700 gram male who's neutered, for example, and you have a 300 gram female, no one's going to have issues with you putting them together, even though while it's rare that males will have aggression toward female rats, it does happen. So like he could still do a lot of damage to her, but no one has an issue with them being together because they're both labeled as standard size rats. But if you said she was a dwarf, all of a sudden people would have issues with it. So I feel like for me personally, it's so much more of a temperament thing, because the size range for both dwarfs and standard size rats is so vast. So I have Agatha, who's probably gonna maybe top out at 90 grams, and I'm going to have her in with rats that are 200 grams, and no one's gonna have a problem with that because they're all dwarfs. But if I try to put her with a rat that was 250 grams but was a standard size, people would have issues with that. And that does not make sense. It just doesn't. I feel like temperament is way more of a factor, which is where you have to be careful, because a lot of times you're not going to know that your rat's going to develop hormonal aggression until you put them into intros. Because sometimes your rat is even living with rats they didn't know their whole life will be perfectly fine, and then you do intros, and then hormones get going and they get aggressive. And that is the dangerous thing. You have to be so careful with intros with standard size to dwarf. And now for me, again, I choose to keep mine separate because mostly it's a split between the food, because I want to make sure that everyone's getting not too much, not too little food, especially since I have a lot of rats that have been spayed or neutered, and keeping a spayed or neutered rat a good condition is so much harder. And then yes, the aggression, because I have rats who have been so unpredictable or so aggressive, like Sailor, that it just kind of put me off to the idea of putting a very small rat in with them. But the thing with even that is, like, you can get dwarfs and standards in the same litter, and typically, not always, but a lot of time, a rat will be kinder to their litter mates than strange rats. So like if you get litter mates, I don't think there's an issue keeping them together, and trying to keep them separate all the time does create a problem of, if you have, so dwarf is a recessive gene, meaning that both parents need to carry it, and even if both parents carry it, that doesn't necessarily mean that the baby will have it. So like you often will get a standard sized mom with a dwarf dad, and they both carry the gene, but a lot of babies are going to be standard. So you can often get a situation where you have a litter that is mostly standard with like one dwarf rat, and then you have to find companionship for that dwarf, which can work out, but can also not. So I find that saying definitively no, you cannot keep them together is A, not necessarily true, and B, not necessarily possible all the time. Dwarfs are fairly new to the fancy. They're not that common. They're getting more common every single year, every single month even. But you can find yourself in a situation, especially rescues, where you end up with a single dwarf. They need companionship. They still need other rats. They're not a different species. They still act the same. Their diet's the same. They're just small. And they do tend to have a lot more energy. But they still need companions. And if you don't have other dwarfs, I think it's fine to put them with standards. So, basically what I'm saying is, yes, you can keep dwarf rats with standard size rats. Just be sure that the temperament of the standard size rats is bomb proof, and monitor their weights very closely to make sure that everyone's getting the right amount of food. Because even within dwarf groups, sometimes that can be difficult with the size variations, and same with standards. Sometimes it's just harder sometimes to make sure certain rats are getting the right amount of food. If you do choose to put them together, just be very careful, monitor them closely, make sure that they're solid before moving them up from stage to stage in intros. And yes, for me, the answer is no, I won't keep my dwarfs with my standards, because I've had too many experiences with my standards going off the rails, basically. So for me, the answer is no, but I don't think that it's wrong necessarily for you to keep your dwarfs with your standard size rats. Most people in the US and Canada that I've seen have dwarfs also have standard size rats, and they do combine the groups, and it is okay. I've only seen it not work out, I think, one time. But if you talk to breeders, you will notice they're very hesitant to just give a flat out yes. They always put like contingencies on it, like, well, if the standards are very friendly, then yes, you can do that. And that is because it is more dangerous to have a mixed group than to have separate ones. I hope that was helpful to you guys. I hope I didn't like just ramble that whole time. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, you know what to do. All the fun stuff down below. And I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!